Morning. Derek, Danny, look at that screen. That looks weird. It's zoomed in. We'll be all right. We'll make do. The presenter screen in the back looks kind of odd. Yeah, it's zoomed in a lot. Oh, there we go. That's good, guys. Thank you. So we're going to, Lord willing, cover Matthew chapter 10 today. That's my intention. It's a long chapter, so got a lot of material to get through. This is the second out of Matthew's 5 major discourses. And when we use that terminology, what we're referring to are these big chunks of teaching that Jesus gives in Matthew's gospel account. And this is something that's characteristic of Matthew's gospel account and not quite as characteristic of some of the other ones. Something that Matthew seems to emphasize more is these big clumps of teaching that Jesus gives. And you can kind of see, because keep in mind, we assume his readers are intended to be Jewish. And so you can kind of see Matthew portraying this idea of Jesus being the master teacher and us as his disciples sitting at his feet learning from the master teacher. And so that's the idea here that we see with Matthew in this gospel. And so this is the second out of 5 major discourses, 5 major pieces of teachings. The first was the Sermon on the Mount, and now we're getting here to Matthew chapter 10. And this is commonly referred to as the missionary discourse. And the reason for that is because this is Jesus commissioning the 12. He's called the 12. They're going to be the 12 apostles. And Jesus in this chapter gives them authority, and he sends them to go and carry out his mission, to do the same things that he had been doing. And so that's why it's commonly called the missionary discourse. Notice also, sometimes when we're studying the Bible, we tend to take things out of context and we take something and directly apply it to us. But we need to remember the context of this. Jesus, in this chapter, is directly addressing the 12. And so Jesus is addressing the 12 apostles here. And so naturally, he's telling them some things that might be applicable for us, but there are some things he tells them that are not applicable for us. For example, he gives them the authority to cast out demons and heal and all of these things. Well, obviously, he doesn't give that same authority to us. And so that's one example of a specific thing where it's important to remember the context of this. This is addressed specifically to the 12 apostles. Another thing is this discourse is prompted by the end of Matthew chapter 9. We didn't look at that in our study last week, in part because it segues nicely into Matthew chapter 10. And so we'll briefly look at that here in a moment. But before we get to that, here are some of the major topics that Jesus will cover in this clump of teaching. And some things he covers in depth, some things we can kind of infer. Like, for example, we learn a lot about the 12 apostles here. Matthew lists them out here. He lists out the 12 apostles from Peter on down to Judas. And so he lists the apostles. He lists them in pairs. In Mark's account with this, he mentions that they went out in pairs. And so we have some things about the 12 apostles here. We also get an idea of the Christian mission. Jesus commissions the apostles to go and do these things. These are by and large the same things that Jesus had already been doing. We'll see that as we go through it. And what we see about the Christian mission here, at least as it pertains to the apostles, is what that mission is, first and foremost, how it's done, where they were to go, who they were to go to, so on and so forth. And we also see some things toward the end of the discourse about the response to the Christian mission. In particular, they're going to be rejected. They're going to face persecution. Jesus warns them about that. That's a pretty prominent thing that comes up in this discourse. There's also towards the end how if someone receives you, he's addressing the apostles again, if someone receives you, they've also received me, and they receive the one who sent me, as he says. So a lot in here about not just the Christian mission, but the response to those who carry out the Christian mission, in particular to the 12 apostles. So this is the structure of how we're going to look at this morning. I've broken it up into 5 sections. You have the introduction, which begins actually in chapter 9, introducing the need for the Christian mission, with what Jesus says at the end there. Then he commissions the 12. He issues a warning about how they're going to be persecuted. He gives them a word of encouragement in light of the fact that they are going to be persecuted. And then he has some things at the end to say about worthiness, those who are worthy of me, in his words, and then the reward that they receive. So with that in mind, because we've got a lot to cover, let's look first at the introduction, which actually begins back in Matthew chapter 9, starting in verse 35. So Matthew 9 and verse 35, it says, "And Jesus went throughout all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, and healing every disease and affliction." One thing to notice, if you look there in Matthew 9 and verse 35, that might sound familiar if you've been going through our study, in part because Matthew chapter 9 and verse 35 is almost a quotation. Matthew's not quoting himself, but it's almost a repetition of chapter 4 and verse 23. And there's a lot of parallels between these two. They're almost word for word the same. There's a few differences, but it's more or less the same. Both of these verses highlight Jesus going throughout the cities and the villages. Here in 9 and verse 35, it says he went throughout all the cities and villages. In chapter 4, it says he went throughout all of Galilee. So that, I think, is the variation. But other than that, it's word for word the same. And so he's going throughout the area, covering a lot of square footage. Both of these verses highlight Jesus' actions, in particular teaching. He's teaching in their synagogues. He's preaching the gospel of the kingdom, the good news of the kingdom. And he's healing their afflictions and diseases and so on. And one other thing is both of these are transitioning from what is a narrative account into what is a discourse, into a big clump of teaching. Chapter 4 and verse 23, it's transitioning into the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew chapter 5 is the beginning of that. So it's transitioning from narrative to discourse, and now we have the same thing in chapter 9 and verse 35. We're transitioning from this clump of narrative into this clump of teaching once again. And so here are the verses on the screen just to show you. And just briefly, we see here the comparison. He went through it all of Galilee. He went through it all of their cities and villages. And this is in the English Standard Version, by the way. That's the translation that I'm reading from. And then everything else, teaching in their synagogues, proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom, healing every disease and every affliction among the people. It's almost word for word the same. This is something I think that Matthew's doing on purpose, perhaps serving as a rhetorical device to show the transition that's happening, and also highlighting Jesus' ministry is going to directly tie in with the ministry of the apostles as well. I think that's something that might be happening here as well. So in verse 35, he goes throughout the region. He's healing people. He's teaching. He's preaching, so on and so forth. We come to verse 36, and it says, "When he saw the crowds, he had compassion for them, because they were harassed and helpless, like sheep without a shepherd. Then he said to his disciples, 'The harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest.'" So we see in verse 36, after this transition, that Jesus has compassion for the crowd. The word in the Greek kind of implies literally that his heart goes out for them. The word comes from the Greek word splagna, which is the word for heart. The other word is cardia, but splagna, and it's kind of a more deep, more intimate way of thinking of it, and it's the verb form of that. So he more or less has his heart on his sleeve for these people. And the reason for that, the reason for Jesus' compassion towards them, is because they're like sheep without a shepherd. Matthew even says as much. That's the reason for this compassion. Which is interesting, because when we see lost people, how do we feel for them? Sometimes we might feel contempt for some people, depending on who they are, the things they do, and so on. Jesus has compassion for them, and I think that's something that we should try to have as well. another aspect of this, Jesus' moment of compassion is also an indictment on the Jewish leaders. These are sheep who do not have a shepherd. Well, the Jewish leaders are supposed to be the shepherds of the people, and they're obviously failing in that, which is part of the reason why Jesus is here. He needs to save us. And the Jews having failed as shepherds is not a new thing. This isn't something that was unique to Jesus' time. This is something throughout all of Israel's history has been a problem. And there's a lot of places you could look in reference to the failed leadership of the Jewish people, but there's even a few places that specifically use this language of them being as sheep without a shepherd. There's three places in particular that I'll show you quickly. One is in Ezekiel chapter 34. The Jewish people reading Matthew's gospel, some of these would immediately come to their minds, and I'm sure Ezekiel chapter 34 is one of them, because in Ezekiel chapter 34, the Lord is indicting the Jewish leaders for their failed leadership. And he compares them to shepherds who feed themselves rather than feeding their flock. They're fattening themselves while neglecting the people they're supposed to be caring after. And so that is what happens in Ezekiel 34, and the Lord gives them that indictment. They're treating Israel like they're sheep without a shepherd. In 1 Kings chapter 22, there's the prophet Micaiah, and he gives this word of prophecy. You might remember, I think it's Jehoshaphat was the king of Judah. He's in cahoots with King Ahab of Israel. They're wanting to team up for military purposes. And before they do that, they want to attack Syria, if I remember right. And Ahab sends for these prophets, and they all say, "Oh, go and do it. The Lord will give you this battle." And he says, "Well, there's one more prophet we need to hear from, and it's Micaiah, and he's the only honest one." And at first he tells them what they want to hear. Ahab inquires a little more, and he says, "What I see is the people being like sheep without a shepherd." In other words, Ahab was a failed leader. And of course we know that to be true if you know the history of the kings. Ahab was, of course, a failure of a leader. And another thing we see with this same terminology, that of sheep without a shepherd, this was a chief concern of Moses. This may have come up when we studied Numbers all last year, whenever that was, when in Numbers chapter 27, Moses is preparing for his death, and so he's setting things in order so that Israel can continue to be sustained and be successful. And one of his concerns is how Israel is not going to have a shepherd. Moses is going to die. He's not going to be there. They need someone to lead them. And this is the moment, it's kind of an intimate moment, when in Numbers 27, the Lord puts up Joshua to be Moses' successor, more or less. And Moses' concern, again, is Israel is going to be like sheep without a shepherd. Moses has been their leader. He's been their shepherd. He's, along with God, of course, been leading them through the Exodus period as they get to the Promised Land. So they need a leader. Moses is concerned about that. And it's interesting the parallels you can make between Moses and Jesus, because this is also a concern that Jesus has. He has compassion on this crowd because they are sheep without a shepherd. We know ultimately, because we read John's Gospel, where Jesus says, "I am the good shepherd." With Moses, the solution was Joshua. With Jesus, he is the solution. So an interesting parallel that you could make there with Jesus and Moses. And so he sees this crowd, and after he sees the crowd, they're like sheep without a shepherd, Jesus makes an observation. In the observation, he draws this comparison to that of a harvest. And he says, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. In other words, there are a lot of lost people, but not enough people to bring them back into the fold. You've got a lot of harvest here, but not enough people to go out and get it. And that was the problem that Jesus saw. You've got a lot of lost people, but not enough people to bring them back in. And so what's the solution to this? Well, Jesus offers us a solution that anyone and everyone can do. And that solution is simply to pray about it. He says, "Therefore pray earnestly to the Lord of the harvest to send out laborers into his harvest." It's obvious that we need laborers. Jesus draws this to our attention. And so we need people to go out and actually do the work. But we realize that not everyone can and should do that. But everyone can and should, at the very least, pray about this. Pray earnestly is what Jesus says. And I think this is interesting because you hear a lot of strategies about evangelism. We've got a flyer, a poster out in the hallway from house to house, heart to heart, with 18 evangelism strategies, 18 things that any ordinary Christian can do. And those are good things. And I think this is probably on there. But any strategy that a church or an organization or what have you, any strategy that someone has for evangelism, it needs to be centered on prayer first and foremost. Then you can carry out what you set to do. But Jesus shows us here that prayer needs to be at the forefront of our strategy. And so now we transition from chapter 9 into chapter 10. And so Jesus has shown us that there's a problem. There's a need. There's a need for laborers to go out and into this harvest. Well, now, as we get into chapter 10, Jesus is going to send out his laborers, who are the 12 apostles. One thing that I find interesting, and I don't know necessarily what the reason for this is, I'm working on it, is when in chapter 10 and verse 2, this is where he names the apostles. In chapter 10 and verse 2, let me read verse 1 first. He called to him his 12 disciples and gave them authority over unclean spirits, to cast them out, to heal every disease and every affliction. The names of the 12 apostles are, and then he lists the 12. When he says apostles, when Matthew does, there in chapter 10 and verse 2, that's the only time that the word apostle appears in Matthew's gospel. That's really fascinating, and I'm not quite sure why that is. It might have something to do with the fact that he's trying to make disciples, and so the emphasis is more on these being disciples than being apostles. That's what some commentators speculate. I'm not quite sure about that, but it's an interesting thing. Now, the verb form of this appears other places, because the noun is apostolos, and he uses the verb form of this in this commission when he sends them out. That's the idea here. And I don't remember the verb form of it off the top of my head, but he does use the verb form later on. But the noun, when you refer specifically to the apostles, that only appears once in Matthew's gospel, and it's right here. And it's an interesting thing. And the word apostle, you may remember this if you participated in our Acts study on Wednesday nights a couple years ago. The word apostle literally means one who is sent. And the idea behind an apostle, in the broad sense of the word, is it's one who is sent on behalf of another. And so it's sort of like a representative. And so if I send someone to somewhere on my behalf, they go to that place, they're speaking for me. It's my words that they're saying. And that's the reality of who the apostles are. These apostles are going to be the very mouthpieces of Jesus after his ascension to heaven, once they go into the world and do as he says in Matthew 28, go into all the world and make disciples. And so an apostle is one who is sent. In particular, it's one who is sent on behalf of another. And so these apostles are going to be Jesus' representatives in the world. And so when the apostles speak, they're speaking with the authority of Jesus, which is not a light thing. It's a very important thing for us to realize. And so when an apostle speaks, it's different than when an ordinary disciple speaks. I can say one thing, I'm just a disciple, right? And I try to be the best disciple I can be. But if I say something that's different than, say, Peter says, you better side with Peter over me, because Peter's an apostle and I'm not. And so that's the level of authority that these 12 are going to have, that Jesus gives them. And some more facts about the 12. They get the authority to speak for Jesus, but we see in verse 1 that they also have authority from Jesus. It's not anything of their own, but he gives it to them. They have authority to cast out demons. and to heal every disease and every affliction. And so Jesus delegates his authority to them. This is a sign of a good leader. You hear this a lot if you tune into different leadership seminars, not just spiritual-based leadership, but leadership in general in the business world or what have you. One of the things that's talked about in that realm is being able to delegate authority. If you can delegate authority and you're raising up new leaders in that sense, that's a good thing. And Jesus is doing that here. He's delegating his authority to these 12. Another thing, you look at the list, I won't read it, but notice that Simon Peter is listed first. And Matthew even specifically says, he says the names of the 12 apostles are these. First, Simon, who is called Peter. So he highlights the fact that Peter is first. I don't know if there's much significance to that. We certainly see Peter have an elevated role among the others. Some go as far as saying that he's first among equals, and I think that's certainly true. We see him, he certainly is louder than the rest, and maybe that is part of it. Sometimes that loudness gets him in trouble through the Gospels, but once he receives the Spirit throughout the book of Acts, we see a lot of the good things come from Peter. And think about Peter, he gives the first gospel sermon. In chapter 16 of this book, Jesus is going to tell Peter that he's going to have the keys to the kingdom. And so that says something good about Peter, I think. He's listed first. And notice also that Judas Iscariot is listed last. Some speculate what the order is that Matthew has in mind here. If perhaps it's in order of prominence, if it's in order of when they're called. We don't know the order that they're called in besides the one we read of. We've read of 5 of them being called. We don't read about the other ones much, if at all, really, at least in Matthew's gospel. But Judas is listed last, and I think the reason for that is probably, at the very least, because he's the least prominent one in terms of his role. Because we know what his role is, and we know that because Matthew actually spoils it for us. If someone's reading through Matthew's gospel for the first time and they don't know the ending, they're going to get it spoiled here. Because at the very end, in verse 4, he's going through the list. He gets to Simon the Zealot and Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. So Matthew spoils at least Judas's betrayal here at this point. His betrayal is foreshadowed. And when you look through this narrative, or through this teaching here, there's a lot of foreshadowing that Jesus gives us. So Matthew lists the 12, and now Jesus calls the 12, which brings us to the commission. And so he gives instructions to the 12 about what they are to do. And there's 2 aspects of this, as I see it, that Jesus covers with this. One aspect of this is obviously their ministry, the things they're going to be doing, the actual work that they're going to be doing. So that's one aspect of this, their ministry, their work, their labor, but then also their response to the people who they minister to. They're going to respond in such a way. How do they respond back to them? That's part of what Jesus addresses here. So he's going to talk about what they're doing and then how they respond when people respond to them. But before he tells them what they're going to do, he tells them who they're going to do it to, who they're going to go to. And where they're going, who they're going to, is to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. This is specifically for them in that moment in time. They're to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. We have in Matthew 28 what's called the Great Commission, when he says, make disciples, right, go into all the world and make disciples, so on and so forth. That's to everybody, go into all the world. But here it's just to the lost sheep of Israel. And so some coin this as the limited commission, because it's limited to the people of Israel, not necessarily to the whole world. They're going to evangelize Gentiles. That's going to come later. But for now, the mission is to the lost sheep of Israel. They're the ones who are most ready for it at this moment in time. But eventually the Gentiles will be ready for it. And it's going to be Peter who does it for the first time with Cornelius. So he tells them to go to the lost sheep of Israel. And when they go to Israel, Jesus, in this, he gives them 5 things to do in terms of the work of their actual ministry. There's more verbs here, but some of that is catered toward their response. But he gives them 5 things to do here. First, they're to proclaim. Some of your versions may say preach. This is in verse 7. He says, proclaim as you go, saying the kingdom of heaven is at hand. By the way, that's the same exact message Jesus was giving, which was the same as what John the Baptizer was giving, so on and so forth. So the message is the same. They're to proclaim. They are to heal. They are to raise the dead. They are to cleanse leprosy. And then they are to cast out demons. This is the work that they are to do. And notice that the work of these apostles, who Jesus is sending out to be his representatives, notice that their work, their ministry is the same things that Jesus has already been doing. And we've read about them. A lot of it we read in chapters 8 and 9. Jesus doing some of these very things. He went about preaching the good news of the kingdom, which is that the kingdom of heaven is at hand. Same thing. He's healing their diseases. He's raised the dead. He raised Jairus' daughter, remember already. He's cleansed leprosy. We saw that at the beginning of chapter 8. And he's done a lot of casting out of demons. And so Jesus is delegating to these apostles, and their mission is the same mission as Jesus at this point. Jesus' ultimate mission is to go to the cross. But for now, he's doing these things, and the apostles are going to be doing the same thing. Then he instructs them about responding to others. One aspect of this is they are to give without pay. In other words, go and do these things and don't expect anything in return. And in fact, don't just expect it, don't not expect it, but don't take it if it's offered to you. He says, don't take any gold or silver or copper. Don't take any of this payment. Don't take a bag or a tunic or sandals or a staff. Don't accept these things if they're offered to you. Don't take these things. And again, the reason for this, partially, if not wholly, is because this is something that Jesus was doing. And so their mission, their work is the same work that Jesus has already been doing. And we know Jesus was doing this in part because it's implied. You can see it in what he's doing. But he also says to them, you've received without paying, and so now you're going to give without receiving payment. Jesus has not received payment. They've been the recipients of it. Now they're going to be the givers of it. Also, while they're in a town or a village, they are to stay in someone's home. They don't get booked in a fancy hotel or anything, like what you might see today. You bring a guy in for a gospel meeting, and sometimes it's their preference to stay in a hotel. I don't think there's anything wrong with that necessarily, as long as it's affordable, right? You don't want to break the bank setting up the preacher for the gospel meeting. But Jesus says you're to stay in someone's home, and this is something also that Jesus was doing. We saw it before when he said in chapter 8, when he said to the scribe, the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. He doesn't have a permanent residence. He's just going wherever and staying with whoever. And so while they're in a town or a village, they're to stay with someone else. And if that person is worthy, and we see what it means to be worthy later on, if they're worthy, then the apostles are to let their peace be upon it. And this is a deeply Jewish thing, letting their peace be upon this. But if someone doesn't receive them, or if they don't listen to their words, I think that's the same thing, then Jesus instructs the apostles to shake the dust from their feet and leave. Don't dwell on it too much. Shake the dust off your feet and leave. And this is something we actually see put in practice by the Apostle Paul, who interestingly was not present here at this time to receive this commission, but some way or another he knew about it, because we see him and Barnabas do this when they leave Antioch of Pisidia in Acts 13 and verse 51. We see also Jesus adds a word of judgment on those who don't receive the apostle. So he's already told them, if they don't receive you, if they don't listen to you, shake the dust off your feet, keep going. Don't dwell there too long. But he goes on to say, and this is a really strong indictment of judgment, he says that the judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah will be more bearable than that of those who deny these apostles. He says that in verse 15. And he predicates it by saying, truly I say to you. So he predicates it, he emphasizes it at the beginning. This is a true statement. It will be more bearable on the day of judgment for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah than for that town, the town that rejects the apostles. This says something about if we accept or reject the apostles and consequently their doctrine, I think. This is something that could apply to us today. If we reject that, Sodom and Gomorrah will have it easier than we will. And that really says something, because you think about the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, what happened to them? They got burned up. You hear the expression, the hellfire and the brimstone and the sulfur. That's where that comes from, is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. And it's going to be more bearable for them than it would be if they reject the apostles' teaching. That's a strong word of judgment from Jesus there. So he gives that warning about those who would reject the apostles. And now he's going to give a warning to the apostles themselves. He warns them about what they're getting into, what they're going to face. They have the idea going into this, because Jesus told them, that they're going to have harsh treatment. And so as we transition into verses 16 and following, he warns the 12 of the harsh treatment they're going to receive. And it's certain. It's not, well, you might get treated this way, you may get treated that way. It's certain they will get treated this way. It's certain that it will happen. And he starts this by saying, in verse 16, I'm sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. And this is where he gives them the instruction to be wise as serpents, yet innocent as doves. And this is an interesting thing that Jesus says, because you think about the relationship between a sheep and a wolf. Wolves seek to devour sheep. That is at the forefront of their mind. They don't care about anything else. They want to devour that sheep. This is why Jesus, when he talks about false prophets, he uses this same analogy, like a wolf in sheep's clothing, to be deceptive about that. Well, here he says, I'm sending you out as sheep, and you're going to be out among the wolves. And so they are obviously in a great deal of danger here with regards to this. And he gives them some specific things that are going to happen to them. And when you go through the book of Acts, and when you go through the early secular history of the things that happened to these men, many, if not all of these things came true for most of them. He said they're going to be delivered to the courts. We see that happen a lot in the book of Acts. Paul was imprisoned. I know he's not specifically here, but Paul happened to that. Peter was in prison. Peter and John, all of the apostles in the book of Acts get thrown in prison at one point. They're going to be delivered to the courts. They'll be flogged in the synagogues. And they'll be dragged before governors and kings. This is something that ultimately happens to many of these men. And another thing we see happening here, we've seen it throughout this, with what these men are going to do, what Jesus is sending them to do. This is something that Jesus is going to go through as well. This is foreshadowing what's going to happen to Jesus during what's called the Passion account. That word passion comes from the Latin word for suffering. Jesus is going to suffer a great deal when we get toward the end of this gospel account. This is looking ahead at what Jesus is going to go through, and these apostles are going to go through the same things, which once again shows what they're doing, Jesus is doing. If not now, he will be doing. And when these men, when these apostles are going to be brought before these courts and these rulers, part of that is they're going to have to be able to make a defense. They're going to have to stand up for themselves. They're going to have to give a defense about what they're doing. They're going to have to say something. And they don't need to worry about what they're going to say. You could imagine the pressure they're going to have. What am I going to say to get out of this? I hope I don't say the wrong thing. I hope I don't go as far as even denouncing my affiliation with Christ. Well, Jesus says they don't have to worry about that. And again, keep in mind this is addressed specifically to them. I wouldn't go as far as saying this applies to us. They don't have to worry about it because the Spirit will be speaking through them. The Holy Spirit will speak through them, and it will be His words and not theirs. And so they're not going to have to worry about what sort of defense they're going to have to make, what things they're going to say when they're testifying before other men, because the Spirit will speak through them. Something that I think is unique to the 12. And we see again the persecution that they will experience. This is part of the reality of being a disciple of Jesus. And this is something that applies to all of us because the New Testament speaks about this. Think about what the Apostle Paul says when he says, all who desire to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted. That's in 2 Timothy somewhere. I don't remember the exact place, but that's what Paul says. And so this applies to us as well. We're going to suffer for Jesus' sake. And the reason for this is because, as he says in verse 24, a disciple is not above his teacher. If Jesus is going to suffer these things, how much more will we suffer? Right? How much more should we suffer? Jesus, he's perfect. He lives a perfect life. And yet, he suffers the deal that he does. Well, how much more will we suffer then? If Jesus is going to suffer, so also will they. And he goes on to say at the end of this, in verse 25, he says, and remember, this is looking back at something they said before. He says, if they have called the master of the house Beelzebul, how much more will they malign those of his household? They've accused Jesus of certain things. How much more will they to the 12? And consequently to us. And Jesus, he says this a lot in John's gospel. The world has hated me. It's going to hate you as well. Next, we have this word of encouragement that Jesus gives to the 12. Despite all of this persecution, this would be a downer, right? You're pumped up, you're going to go out, and you're going to do the things Jesus has you do. And then he says, well, you're going to suffer a great deal because of me. And keep in mind, in the Beatitudes, Jesus says that that's a blessing. It's a blessing to suffer for his sake. May not feel like it, but it is a blessing, as Jesus says. And despite their certain persecution, the persecution that will come to them, Jesus tells them to have no fear. Someone has said it, that this is the thing that's commanded the most in the Bible, to not fear. Fear not. Be not afraid. I haven't looked that up to verify that, but it's probably true. I don't have a reason to doubt that it would be. Jesus tells them to have no fear, and the reason for this, in part, is because they're going to have all things revealed to them. In verse 26, he says, have no fear of them, for nothing is covered that will not be revealed, or hidden that will not be known. What I tell you in the dark, say it in the light, and what you hear whispered, proclaim on the housetops. And so in part, they're going to have the answers. They're going to have this knowledge. And it's like Jesus says in John 8:32, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And if you're free, if you're truly free from sin is what he's talking about there. If you're truly free, you have nothing to fear. True freedom does not warrant fear. And so that's part of it. And another part of it just pertains to the perspective that they're going to have, and this is something that Jesus addresses. And what he says is, don't fear those who can kill the body but who can't kill the soul. Don't fear those who can only kill you mortally and not eternally. Don't fear those people. Instead, fear the one who can kill both, who can kill your body and your spirit. Fear the one who can kill both. What this shows us is that the spiritual is, of course, of much more importance than the physical. And it also tells us that these people can only do so much, but there's one who can do so much more. And that's a positive thing if you're in the right camp, but it's a bad thing also if you're in the wrong camp. And so we need to fear the one who can harm us, who can kill us both physically and spiritually, which of course is God. He also offers perspective about their value as people and their value as these chosen apostles of Christ. And he uses this analogy of sparrows. He says, He says in verse 29, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? In other words, they're not worth much. They sell for a penny, 2 of them. And not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father. When you would sell sparrows, during the transaction, you handled them very delicately because they're delicate creatures. And so you had to handle them with an intense amount of care. And so they were handled and treated delicately, and yet they're only worth a penny. they're not worth much of anything. And he uses this sort of rhetorical question, like he does in the Sermon on the Mount, when he goes on to say, let's see, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Let's see, where is this? In verse 31, fear not, therefore, you are of much more value than pennies, or than sparrows. We as people are much more valuable than these sparrows are. And so this should be an immense source of comfort for all of us, but especially for them who are going to be carrying out this mission that Jesus gives them. And another perspective that we can have is we should not fear if we acknowledge Christ. He says in verse 32, so everyone who acknowledges me before men, I also will acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven. But whoever denies me before men, I also will deny before my Father who is in heaven. So, if we acknowledge Christ, we shouldn't have anything to fear. Because if we acknowledge Him, He'll reciprocate that and He will acknowledge us. And if Christ acknowledges us before the Father, what is there that we can fear? Paul phrases it a little differently in the book of Romans. If God is for us, who can be against us? The answer is nobody. We have nothing to fear. And so if we acknowledge Him, He will reciprocate that acknowledgement before the Father. But the flip side is also true. If we deny Him, that denial is also reciprocated, which ties into what he said before with the idea of fear. We shouldn't fear the ones who can only kill us physically, but the one who can kill us physically and spiritually, being God the Father. How much more do I have? I don't have time to get through the rest. Any comments or questions? I'll have to pick the rest up next week. All right, thanks.